Well, hello, everybody. This is Rabbi Dan Levin, and this is Essential Questions. In 1954, a young psychologist named Leon Festinger infiltrated a small cult who believed the world would end on December 21st, 1954. They wanted to know how the members of the group would respond when, God willing, the world would continue to spin. The group's leader, whom they called Marion, had told her faithful that a flying saucer would come and pick them up and bring them to safety. Many of her followers had quit their jobs, sold their homes, and had given away their money in anticipation of the end. But by 4:45 a.m., when the spaceship had not arrived, Marion announced her new vision. They had all been spared because of their unwavering faith, and that God had told her that from the mouth of death you have been delivered. Instead of raging at Marion for destroying their lives or losing faith in her for false prophecy, amazingly, the members of her group became even more devoted. In studying this phenomenon, Dr. Festinger discovered a powerful psychological force, cognitive dissonance. Cognitive dissonance is a state of tension that occurs when a person is forced to confront two divergent ideas that are psychologically inconsistent with each other. For example, I like to think of myself as a pretty good guy who cares about others and does the right thing. And then let's suppose I lose my temper and I yell at my wife. So now I have dissonance. I'm a good guy, but good guys don't yell at their spouses. So how do I resolve that inner conflict? So one option is to admit that maybe I'm not such a good guy after all, that I made a mistake and did a bad thing, and so I have to apologize and ask forgiveness. But facing that hard truth is really, really hard. So another way to deal with that inner conflict is to shift the blame. Well, if she hadn't set me off, if she hadn't let me down, if she hadn't ignored me, then I wouldn't have yelled. That seems a whole lot easier. Now I'm not the bad guy. It was really her fault. Dissonance creates all kinds of challenges for us. We justify all kinds of bad behaviors. We remain loyal to people who are dishonest or hurt and abuse us. We lose our capacity to see the world as it really is, and instead construct all kinds of distorted perceptions of reality. We cling to conspiracy theories, fall prey to prejudices, and all kinds of other ideas that aren't true. Understanding this powerful psychological phenomenon is crucial to understanding not simply our own reluctance to admit wrong or to change, but also so many of the dangerous trends we see in the news and in our society that makes us not only scratch our heads, but that make our hearts climb into our throats with worry. To help us understand what makes cognitive dissonance and other related phenomena such powerful psychological forces, we turn today to two remarkable psychologists. Dr. Martin Segel leads the Segel Psychological Center and has been a practicing psychologist for more than 25 years. An expert in acculturative stress and depression, Dr. Segel earned his Ph.D. in clinical psychology from the California School of Professional Psychology in Fresno. He also earned a master's in counseling psychology from Houston Baptist University and did his undergraduate work at the University of Texas at Austin. He also trained at the University of Miami School of Medicine. Dr. Marissa Roecklein earned her Ph.D. in clinical psychology from Nova Southeastern University. She completed a predoctoral internship at South Florida State Hospital and her postdoctoral residency at the Clinical and Forensic Institute. She is the founding president of Mental Illness New Directions, or MIND, a group dedicated to advocating for individuals with serious and persistent mental illness. Dr. Roecklein works with patients suffering from anxiety, depression, bipolar disorder, schizophrenia, post-traumatic stress, personality disorders, substance abuse, and currently specializes in couples therapy. So glad to have you both with us today. Thanks so much. So I tried in my kind of amateurish way to outline a basic understanding of cognitive dissonance, but tell me a little bit more, Martin, about it. What is cognitive dissonance? How does it really work?
So cognitive dissonance ultimately is, as you described, it's the discomfort that people get when they have two alternating beliefs that are incongruent with one another, and they try ultimately to reduce this dissonance to get what we call the opposite, which is consonance, to be at peace or at calm. The problem is it's not easily just dissipated. what sometimes happens is you still have these two conflicting beliefs and have a hard time trying to merge them from two separate beliefs into one to get this belief to actually be confluent with both of your alternating opinions or alternating beliefs. And a lot of times we think we've settled cognitive dissonance, but it's still there, and it still continues on, sometimes outside of our awareness even.
So, Marissa, how do you see that in your practice? How does cognitive dissonance sort of play out on a day in your therapy?
Sure. I think, it plays out quite frequently. Oftentimes people will come in, patients will come in without recognizing that the cognitive dissonance is present. So one of the ways where we come in our work is to help them identify that there is actually a conflict between what they're thinking and how they're acting, and that is making them uncomfortable. As humans, we want to be comfortable, right? We want to restore our equilibrium. We don't want to be uneasy. And so if we're having a thought that is conflicting with something that we're doing, oftentimes we don't feel good. And that's where you present for therapy. I don't feel good. I'm not sure why. Something just isn't quite right in my life. So helping somebody really recognize that and understand that there is a dissonance, there's a discrepancy between those things is really the first step towards targeting it and addressing it.
So what is it that makes it so hard for people to sort of say, maybe I am actually not that person who I see in the mirror. Maybe I did a bad thing, or I championed the wrong cause. What's so difficult about sort of making a change like that? Why is that so hard for people?
Well, I think there's a lot of different factors that go into that, but one of the factors I think is what we call sort of like our own identity, our sense of self, who we are. And so a lot of times, in order to change a belief or change a behavior, we have to reject it first and realize that it's not a correct behavior or it's not consistent with our beliefs of who we are. So what ultimately happens is we have a hard time rejecting this belief or who we are as a person beforehand, and we get sort of stuck in the same mode of repeating the behaviors that create the dissonance rather than being able to let go of them.
Yeah, I agree. And I also think that, in my work, I've noticed that we've become somewhat of a black and white society, meaning it's either all or nothing. And a lot of the patients that present to my office, it's we're all or we're nothing, and recognizing that there is a gray area where you can kind of believe both. You can believe a little bit of something and a little bit of something else. It doesn't have to be I'm either this or that. It can be somewhere in between. And people are really uncomfortable with that. You think about Americans going on a diet, and it's like either you're being perfect with your caloric intake and you're meticulously tracking every calorie, or okay, it's a cheat day and I'm going to just eat whatever I want. But what about something in between? And I think as a society, we have a lot of difficulty challenging that black and white thinking. I'm either this or that. And the idea of being somewhere in between is really something that can be so helpful in resolving the dissonance, because really that's where most of us lie.
Yeah, and I think that partly what's really hard for people is to recognize that it's okay to not be perfect. It's okay to not be whatever the ideal is that you've constructed in your mind as what you're supposed to be. It's okay to say, I lost. It's okay to say, I didn't do that well. I mean, I can think of so many times, especially when I was younger, where I would make up stories or I would lie about stuff just because I thought, I'm supposed to be that. And I'm not that, so I'll just make up something, right? So I can kind of be that. And I would either lie to other people or I would lie to myself because I felt like I had to measure up to some standard that I had created and that it wasn't okay to not sort of meet that standard. Why is it that we create these sort of images? Where do all these images come from of what we think we're supposed to be?
Well, I think one of the psychological terms for that is identity protective cognition. We try to believe that we're all good people, or that we're a good person. And so ultimately, in trying to believe that we're a good person, we sometimes do exactly what you said. We fabricate things to fit into our sense of identity, rather than introspecting and saying, gee, maybe this isn't good, but I can still be a good person even if I've done something that's not good. None of us like to look at that way. We just like to think of ourselves as good people. And so we tend to use a defense mechanism to avoid certain traits or avoid looking at certain traits, which then, on the flip side, makes it harder for us to change or to change our cognition.
Yeah, and I think some of what you're saying also speaks to social media, because we have sort of this unrealistic ideal, or this unrealistic expectation, I should say, of what we're quote unquote supposed to do. And a lot of times when individuals are sort of hiding behind the computer, what they're putting out there is not actually true. It's not actually what they're doing, right? So you think about, some of these social media influencers who are posting on these lavish vacations and things like that. And then we have these young girls or young men that are, I should say young women or young men that are thinking that this is what they should be doing as well. And it's not realistic, right? So I think, to answer your question, some of it is really the pressures that we feel from society, a lot of which aren't really realistic. They're being shown to us on social media, and we think, as you said, that we're supposed to be perfect because what we're seeing out there in the media, it looks perfect.
And when you name that idea that actually you don't have to be perfect, that it's okay to make a mistake, people feel such incredible relief. It's, if you think about like the Barbie movie, yes, right? And that famous speech by America Ferrera about what it is to be a woman in society, that speech earned her an Academy Award nomination. And she was good in the movie. She deserved the nomination. But I think it was because of the message that she delivered. People were like, yeah, that's so true. Like, we're so caught in this, like, vortex of we have to do this and we have to be that and we have to do all this. And so it's only natural, I think, that people kind of feel like I need to pretend or I can't admit to my flaws or my failures, which creates an incredible amount of shame, I think, that people deal with by saying, hey, you know what, I may not be as good a student as I'm supposed to be, or as good an athlete as I'm supposed to be, or even as good a friend as maybe I was supposed to be. How does shame work in the midst of all of these different things coming together?
Well, shame is huge because many of us carry shame. And when we're working with patients in a therapeutic setting, one of the hard things is having people feel comfortable or safe enough in the setting to address their, the shameful feelings about themselves. Because when people are afraid to process the shame, they become defensive and get stuck in a rigid way where they're unable to make the change. But shame is huge because none of us want to walk around wearing shame on our back, so to speak. But it is there, and we all try to diminish it. So one of the things I try to do when I'm working with people in the beginning of a therapeutic association is to try to build a safe environment and let them know that sometimes you can have thoughts that aren't necessarily congruent with who you think you are, and that's okay. Thoughts are okay, even if they're not good thoughts. The thing is, we just need to make sure we don't act on these not good thoughts. And so by allowing someone to feel more comfortable expressing it, it also guides them towards being able to make a change.
And I wonder whether shame sort of forces people in some ways to act in ways that are not necessarily authentic, or to hide elements of themselves for fear of being judged as not being right or being problematic, I think is the word that sometimes is used on campus.
Absolutely. And I think, in the sort of umbrella of talking about cognitive dissonance, that's just going to add another layer, right? Because that's another layer of incongruency. You're having to do yet another thing to try to restore your equilibrium, and then building upon your already existing cognitive dissonance with another layer. And so, to speak to what Martin said, really helping people understand that nobody is perfect, right? Nobody is perfect. And the idea that you can change your action, you can change your thought and still be a good person. You can take evidence from the environment. You can take new information and change your mind. And that doesn't have to mean that everything that you said and did prior to that was no good.
So, Marissa, there's this other thing that goes on that's called confirmation bias. right? So what's confirmation bias? How does that work? And how does that feed into the way in which we deal with cognitive dissonance?
Sure. So, when you believe something, when you hold a strong belief, then you're going to inherently look for evidence in your environment that supports that belief, right? So you're going to ignore evidence that may be contradictory to the belief and really look at the evidence that supports it in order to kind of comfort yourself and tell yourself, yeah, I was right. So if you think about an example, let's see, what would be a good example?
Well, I think people, depending on where they are politically, watch their news channel. They get confirmation bias. Or I would imagine same thing on social media. You scroll through and all you really see is stuff that tends to reinforce what you've already believed in, because the algorithm is set up to create almost confirmation bias. And so I think that's one of the reasons why our society has become more polarized in the last 20 years.
Right.
Is because this confirmation bias has sort of bubbled up through all the exposure we have to things that we maybe didn't have 30, 40 years ago.
Yeah, that's a great example.
Yeah, it's interesting. There's someone I know who converted to Judaism a number of years ago and wanted to go to Israel. And she tends towards a sort of left-leaning political way of looking at the world. So she went to Israel and she spent 3 weeks there, and she was having an amazing experience. And then she wrote to me, she said, then I went to Hebron and it all changed for me. Hebron being this place where there is probably the most intense animosity between the Jews who live there and the Palestinians that also are trying to share that difficult space. It's the most probably toxic town in the West Bank. And I said to her, it didn't change anything. She goes, what are you talking about? And I said, you went looking for the story you wanted to be told, and then you found it. And she goes, what are you talking about? I said, all right, so you were in Israel for 3 weeks. You went to Jerusalem, you went to Tel Aviv, you went to the Galilee, right? Hebron on the way to any of those places? She said, no, I had to get a special guide and I had to go there. I go, right. You deliberately wanted to go find the most intense, awful place where Israelis are at their worst. And this is not to excuse any of the horrible things that happened there, but you went looking for the story you wanted to be told. I said, did you go to Sderot? Did you go, this is before the war, did you go to any of the communities that are near Gaza that are dealing with rockets raining down on them on a regular basis? You didn't go there, right? Because you went looking for the story you wanted until someone would tell it to you, and then they told it to you and you felt better. And I think in some ways we do that all the time, right?
100%. I think we do it more now even than we used to do it in the past, what I was explaining earlier. But that's exactly what it is, because when you find the story that you're looking for, now in your own mind, the dissonance is diminished and you can feel at peace because you realize that you actually were right, which goes back to sort of holding on to the pre-existing belief.
So Elliot Aronson and his colleague Judson Mills conducted an experiment at Stanford. And they asked students to join a discussion group about the psychology of sex. So I'm sure it wasn't hard to recruit people for that. Though this was in the 1950s, right? So one group had to fulfill a really embarrassing entrance requirement where they had to read aloud lurid and very sexually explicit passages from racy novels like Lady Chatterley's Lover, which in the 1950s was kind of a big deal. The other group had a much, much easier initiation. And then the participants were made to listen to a deliberately really boring recording of a discussion by the group that they had just tried out to join. So those who had gone through the really difficult initiation talked about how much they enjoyed the experience. No, it wasn't terrible. It wasn't boring. It was great. Now, during the recording, one of the participants who didn't even know what he was talking about, even said during the meeting, you know what, I don't know. I mean, I didn't even do the reading, so I'm not really sure what I'm talking about. And those who were in the lighter initiate group were angry. What an idiot, right? He was irresponsible. He didn't even do the reading, and then he's talking about it. And those who had done harder initiations forgave him. Oh, his candor was so refreshing. Who wouldn't want to be in a group with such an honest guy? So, what's going on here? Why are people more devoted to causes that beat them up or that even cause physical pain in order to be a part of?
It's a great question. And if you think about, restoring the equilibrium, if somebody is going to put themselves out there and put them in a state of physical or mental distress, then in order to justify in their mind internally that they've done that, the outcome must be favorable, right? It must be worth it. It has to be okay. It has to be, oh, that was a riveting speech in the example of your experiment. It can't be, I put myself in this state of discomfort, mental and physical anguish, and that was awful. It wasn't worth it. So it has to be, quote unquote, worth it for them. You think about, in the same sense, paying for an expensive vacation. Let's say you pay, or an expensive meal, let's say. You go to a fancy restaurant and you pay hundreds of dollars for an expensive meal, and the meal isn't great. You're probably going to try to convince yourself that that meal was excellent. Whereas if you had spent, a reasonable amount of money and the meal wasn't great, you might say, all right, let's not come back here. We have to resolve that conflict. We have to change either our thought or our action in order to find that sort of comfort, because we're not comfortable being uncomfortable.
Now, that is true. None of us like to be uncomfortable, and that's ultimately, as you described earlier, how people end up in our office, because there's something that's uncomfortable for them, whether it be their relationship, whether it be something in business, or just a mood state. But what's also amazing to me when people come to us a lot of the time is they're uncomfortable, but they don't really necessarily take the advice to change. It reminds me of that kind of that joke, how many psychologists does it take to change a light bulb? And the answer is one, but it has to want to change. And so you've got to have people get through this discomfort and be able to accept being uncomfortable in order to move forward. And that's kind of a hard thing sometimes.
Yeah, to find that middle ground, not to think that it has to be either or, but that there is something in between. And one of the things I think we've both found in our practice is that one of the most powerful tools in sort of addressing this cognitive dissonance is talking about it, is just being aware of it, having the dialogue and understanding that it exists is really essential in starting to address it.
And one of the other things is empathy, perspective taking. Sometimes, for example, with couples therapy, the husband and the wife come in and the one party, whoever it is, whichever side, doesn't have the ability to look at the perspective of the other person. And I think that goes back to even what you were talking about with October 7th, having the empathy to look at both sides of something and realize that there's another perspective rather than just our own.
Absolutely, that both perspectives are true to that individual.
Yeah, I think there's this difficulty sometimes in living in the gray, right? There's a passage in the Talmud that I always think about that says, Elu ve'elu divrei Elohim chayim, right? These words and those words are the words of the living God. I remember actually a story that one of my teachers, Rabbi Daniel Hartman, who runs the Shalom Hartman Institute in Jerusalem, he was a soldier during the war in Lebanon. His dad was a very famous rabbi and kind of a rationalist. And he was a tank commander. And he got caught in this ferocious battle. And he's hanging off the side of a tank. And, it's chaos. And he realizes in his mind, I don't think I'm going to live through this minute. Mm-hmm. Which is a hard thing, I think, for anyone to get their head around. And he's hanging off the side of a tank, and he kind of wants to pray. But then, because he's Daniel Hartman, he's David Hartman's son, he's like, but I don't believe in a God that would answer in this moment. I'm a rationalist. And this is what he's thinking about while, maybe in the last minute of his life, he says, I kind of want to, I want there to be that God out there, but I'm not sure I believe in that God out there. In the meantime, there's bullets and shrapnel flying all over the place. Thank God he survived. But I remember him talking about the idea, like, we got to be able to hold two truths at once. That it's okay for us to say that's true and that's true at the same time. And you don't necessarily always have to resolve that. How do people make room in their hearts or their heads for two truths?
Well, I think that it's easier for some people than others. And one of the things I try to look at is what we call cognitive flexibility or curiosity. Because some people they see their truth and they have no curiosity to explore any other truth. And so if someone has a curiosity to explore other truths, I think that can help diminish cognitive dissonance. But if they don't have it, then it usually stays. The other thing is with this, what I call cognitive flexibility, again, perspective taking, being able to merge two beliefs and figure out that there is this, what I always like to call charcoal in the middle of the black and white. And we all like the black and white, but at the end of the day, we're living in charcoal for the most of the time. And so having someone have cognitive flexibility and the ability to have more than one belief, or to try to process more than one belief to get to a solution, is an important aspect.
Yeah, and often when you really sit down and take the time to hear somebody else's perspective, you'd be shocked at how much it may make a little bit of sense. You know, if you really take the time to sit down and hear what somebody else has to say, put yourself in their shoes and think about it through their lens, it's not as far-fetched as you originally thought. The key is, or really the challenge is, getting people to the point where they're willing to do that, where they're willing to sit down and have these dialogues and have these discussions, because they are challenging. You're sitting down with somebody who's challenging your beliefs. You're sitting down with somebody who doesn't necessarily agree with you.
I remember reading some of the work of Dr. Jonathan Haidt in trying to explain the difference in the way liberals and conservatives look at the same thing, but through different lenses. So he talked about, like, if you talk about fairness to someone who's liberal, they're going to talk about equity. And they're going to talk about making sure that everybody kind of starts on an even keel, right? If you talk about fairness to someone who's more conservative, they're talking about not being forced to the back of the line unjustly. Did I get what I was entitled to? And a sense of resentment when somebody gets an additional favor. Now, both of those are concepts of fairness. Mm-hmm. But what matters can be different. And I remember loving reading that, because I'm like, oh, we all agree that fairness is important. But if you said to somebody who thinks equity is important, well, don't you understand what that person is saying? Oh, yeah, I agree with that. And if you ask somebody who's more on the conservative side, hey, well, isn't that also kind of an issue of fairness? Well, sure. And maybe there's more to talk about than we think about. But I think that when there are tribal loyalties at stake, identity issues at stake, it becomes really hard. So I think, for example, after October 7th, there was just so many amazing things that happened. In the immediate aftermath of that horrible, horrible day, there were people who had spent lifetimes championing the rights of the Palestinians, all for good reasons. And then they saw that people that they had championed had done outrageously horrible, inhuman acts. And the dissonance that created, I think, for people was astounding. And so there were all kinds of ways in which people tried to resolve that dissonance. So I remember that Queen Noor of Jordan said, no, it didn't really happen. The Israelis made it up, or it didn't happen the way they're saying it happened, or they don't really have proof that this happened. You saw that time and time again in the way that people were responding to the allegations of sexual assault and rape against women, where women's groups, who had typically been on the side of what would be sort of the oppressed, and there was sort of a narrative that the Palestinians are the oppressed and the Israelis are the oppressors, and there is some truth of that, of course. But they didn't jump in to say, hey, look what happened to these Israeli women. This is atrocious. There was, well, did they really tell this truth, or do they really have evidence? I didn't see a rape kit. There was all kinds of doubting the veracity of it. Or at the same time, you had people who said, oh, well, yes, it was bad, but the Israelis are worse, right? So you took an actual genocidal attack on Israelis, and you said, well, the Israelis are committing genocide, right? Because the only way that you can justify what happened on October 7th or in the aftermath is to say, well, the Israelis were worse. And you see it, frankly, also on the side of the Israelis. Oh, there's no famine going on in there. They have plenty of food. There was a picture that was circulating, I remember, in the late winter or the spring, of Palestinians on the beach. And they're like, doesn't look like they're having such a difficult time. Or they would show, a photograph of a marketplace in Gaza, like, looks like they got plenty of food to me. And, so there's all kinds of denial. Where does denial fit in with when we're confronted with things that just violate what we expected to see, or when people don't act the way we think we had hoped they would, or when we're caught in this dissonance place?
It's a great question. You think about when we get an additional piece of evidence, right, that challenges our belief set, and that in and of itself is the definition of cognitive dissonance. We have a belief set about what the world should be like, how people should treat one another, peace and justice, and then something comes in and challenges that belief, then that really strikes us as something very difficult to comprehend. This is challenging our entire idea of what we thought things were. So a defense mechanism in that case would be, I'm just going to deny it. That didn't happen. There's no way that could have possibly happened because it doesn't fit with what I thought was to be true. As opposed to what we've been talking about, which is recognizing, wait a minute, this has happened. What I thought to be true may no longer be the case in this situation. Doesn't mean it wasn't true in the past, but right now in this situation, it's not.
No, it's true. The denial is a defense mechanism to help us cope. Obviously, if we get too hooked into denial, then it may not help us cope because we can't change or shift our perspective. But denial to some degree is on a conscious level. Then there's also a repression, where you repress things, where you actually don't even consciously have awareness of them, which is a deeper type of defense mechanism that's even harder to change because people have even less awareness about the dissonance going on when they repress something as opposed to even just denying it. Because when you deny it, you at least know it's there.
And I think that there is so much that happens on that subconscious level. But those repressed ideas, I think, can be very difficult. You can just look at the history of the 20th century. There are still people out there who are convinced there were weapons of mass destruction. Even though we know there were no weapons of mass destruction. We made a mistake. We thought there were weapons of mass destruction. They weren't there to be found. Mm-hmm. Or there are people who said for years, hey, if we keep going down this economic path, we're going to blow up inflation rates. And then there was no inflation. And then they would sort of figure out ways to justify, right? We saw that time and time again during the pandemic on different sides about whether the vaccines were safe or all kinds of different ways where people were holding on, or whether an election was fair. And people can't let go of those things that they initially said. Doesn't matter whether you're left, right, or center. There are people who just won't let go of what they said. They'll just keep saying it's true even if it's been proved not to be true.
Right, like masks don't work. I said to my son, who told me masks don't work, he was in the hospital with my mother-in-law at the time, and she started coughing and coughing and coughing, and he ran in and put a mask on. I said, but I thought masks don't work.
Right.
And he didn't know what to say. He had a little bit of cognitive dissonance there. And I always say to people, if you're going into an operating room and you're the patient and you see the doctor walk in and coughing and not wearing a mask, do you still believe masks don't work? And you'd be amazed at some of the answers you get, because people don't want to change their beliefs even when faced with new information.
And people don't want to be wrong. I think inherently in our culture, we have this idea that we cannot be wrong. So one of the things that I think we do a lot in our work is challenge the idea that accepting new evidence and changing your belief means you're wrong, because it doesn't. In fact, it means the opposite. It means you're right. It means you're evolving with the times. You may have made the best assessment with the knowledge that you had at the time. When you get new information, it is not wrong to use that information and change your belief. In fact, it's the exact opposite. It's the right thing to do.
Right. And if you can cultivate enough humility, right, it's not about admitting being wrong. It's admitting that we need to keep learning. And I think part of what I've loved about Jewish tradition is this idea that we're constantly evolving. We're constantly learning. We devote ourselves for an entire month and a half to introspection, to reflection, to saying the Holy One, the Creator of the universe, does not expect or anticipate that you're going to be perfect. What is expected is that you will constantly strive to grow or to learn. The best fortune cookie I ever got said, good judgment comes from experience, and experience comes from bad judgment. And I think that if we can sort of put ourselves in a place where we're open to the fact that we don't have to have all the answers. We just have to be curious enough to realize maybe there's more to learn. We can be in a better place. And one of the things that I think about is that confirmation bias and some of these things can actually be leveraged for good, right? So at the same way that, like, if I buy a car and I expense a lot of money to get that car, I'm going to tell you why that car is the greatest car ever, because I want to justify my investment. Or if I spend a ton of time knocking on doors, campaigning for a particular candidate, it's going to be very, very hard for me to ever realize that maybe that candidate isn't the person I thought he or she was, because I've invested so much. But at the same time, right, if I invest a ton of my time or money in a great cause, building a house for Habitat for Humanity where I sweat buckets on a hot day painting the outside of a house that somebody who's never owned a home is going to get to own, or sorting cans at a food bank, or gleaning in a field in a farm in West Boca. There's, a confirmation bias that said, hey, that was a really good thing. Is there ways that you can kind of leverage these different psychological forces so that it helps us to become better, more fuller human beings?
I think one of the things you have to do with that is have small changes first. You can't expect someone to go from this spectrum to this spectrum. And so I think what we have to do, as obviously someone has to have curiosity and openness to change, but you have to slowly give them small changes at a time rather than trying to have them have the whole piece in one shot.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, starting small, taking small bites of the elephant. This is the analogy I love to use with all my patients is if you look at this whole elephant and you think, I need to eat this entire elephant, you're going to freeze, right? It's too much change all at once. If you take one bite at a time, then eventually you've eaten the whole elephant. So really trying to make these changes in small ways, it makes a big difference. It adds up.
And one of the techniques we sometimes do, for example, with couples therapy, is you can have a role reversal. And so what happens is, because again, you got to create empathy and you got to create this openness to change and curiosity about someone else's viewpoint. And so what we sometimes do is role playing where if it's a couples therapy type situation, the husband plays the role of the wife and the wife plays the role of the husband. And it's interesting to see how they play the other person's role. And then in seeing the other perspective, they can create more empathy and then hopefully change their opinion.
And I think that cultivation of empathy is so deeply embedded in our tradition. The whole idea of love your neighbor as yourself, love the stranger, you shall love the stranger, for you yourselves were strangers in the land of Egypt. There's so much embedded in Jewish culture and Jewish tradition of, hey, go walk a mile in that person's sandals and try to understand and be open, connected to the experience of somebody else. So what I'd like to ask, as our custom has been on essential questions, are what are the essential questions that you're asking yourselves these days? What are you wrestling with?
I think that's a great question. I mean, one of the things is, am I being open-minded? Am I understanding this from all perspectives, which speaks to exactly what we're talking about today. Am I taking new information and adjusting what I know? In psychology, there's always research. There's always new research coming out. And sometimes it does challenge what we've previously done. If we think back to when people first started practicing, there were some pretty horrific practices in psychology, or bloodletting, where we were,
we don't do that anymore?
We don't do that anymore. And imagine that. We decided that was not okay. and so I think as psychologists, always asking ourselves, do I need to be doing something differently? Do I need to learn more about this? It's okay to not be an expert in this. However, I need to strive to learn more. I think, one of the worst mistakes that we can make as psychologists is thinking that we're fully competent. You always need to strive for more knowledge, for learning, for evolving practices. Otherwise, it's not going to work. So a long answer to your question, but I think, for me, it's really asking myself, what more can I do? What more can I learn?
That's a huge one. What more can I learn? And the other one also is to shift perspectives, because obviously most of the people that I see in the practice are people who are doing well by the world's standards. And they're coming in with all their issues or problems and focusing only on the negatives. And so one of the things I try to do on a regular basis is sort of make my own gratitude list and remind myself that I'm healthy, I'm in the best country in the world and probably in one of the best places in the country in the world, and that I've got a healthy family. And so I try to always look at things as much as possible from the positive perspective, and then also try to either read or just look at different things from a different perspective to try to grow, to continue to improve.
Yeah, and for me, I think about the need to create a society, or at least communities within society, where it is safe to be imperfect, where it is safe to admit, hey, I missed the mark on that, I backed the wrong horse on that, I wasn't true to myself on that, I wasn't my best self in that encounter. And to not have to experience undue shame or embarrassment, but instead validation of, well, good for you. We're all learning. We're all growing together. We can all strive to be better versions of ourselves as we move along in life.
No, when you're saying that, what strikes me is, we all think by admitting a mistake or admitting that we've made an error in judgment or in some kind of behavior in our life, that it's admitting to weakness. But in my opinion, actually, it's a strength, because if you can never admit to making a mistake, it's really a defense mechanism that is a weakness. Mm-hmm. So it's a dichotomy of what we typically believe.
I agree. One of my favorite sort of interactions that can transpire in therapy is when I'm allowed or provided the opportunity to show my patient that I've made a mistake, because I think it's very transformative for them to say, okay, this is my doctor, this is my therapist, and she's here telling me, wait a minute, I didn't see that correctly. I made a mistake. I interpreted that differently than you intended. And that can be such a powerful interaction to really demonstrate it's okay. We can make mistakes and still be good at what we do. We can make mistakes and still be inherently good people that are trying to do the right thing.
Martin Segel, Marissa Roecklein, this has been such a great conversation. Thanks so very, very, very much. The Essential Questions podcast has been made possible by the Temple Beth El Jewish Ideas Incubator, committed to creativity and innovation in modern Jewish life. Many thanks to our production team, Jason Reeser, Amanda Brenzel, and Susan Stallone. You can find this podcast on Apple Music, Spotify, and the Podbean app, as well as on Temple Bethel's website, tbeboca.org/essential questions. Share this podcast with your friends. Rate us on Apple Podcast or Spotify to spread the word. And we want to know, what are your essential questions? Let us know by emailing us at eq@tbeboca.org. I'm Rabbi Dan Levin, and thanks for listening to the Essential Questions podcast.